The return to work, a balancing act. Amelia Johnson stood in front of the towering glass facade of Pinnacle Marketing, her heart pounding as she gazed at the familiar logo gleaming in the morning sunlight. Today wasn't just another Monday. It was her first day back at work after 6 months of maternity leave. She was no stranger to the hustle and pressure of her role as a senior account manager, but now, the weight of new responsibilities rested heavily on her shoulders. The challenges of motherhood were vastly different from client presentations and project deadlines. With a deep breath, Amelia smoothed down the front of her crisp navy blazer, the tailored suit a reminder of her pre-motherhood life. It felt like armor, holding her together even when her mind raced with questions and her body responded to a new rhythm, pumping breast milk and attending to her newborn son, Jack, who was now in daycare. She had never expected this return to work to feel so complex. The confidence that once defined her had been replaced by a quiet uncertainty. Was she ready for this? Could she balance the demands of being a dedicated mother and a high-performing professional? As Amelia stepped through the revolving doors and into the reception area, a wave of familiar sights and sounds hit her. The gentle hum of ringing phones, the distant clatter of keyboards, and the murmur of conversations filled the air. Yet the atmosphere felt different, like a movie scene she had once been a part of, but now watched from the sidelines. She smiled briefly at the receptionist, who welcomed her back with the same polished professionalism Amelia had always admired. As she waited for the elevator, her mind wandered to Jack. Was he settling in at daycare? Would they call her if he needed something? The guilt weighed heavy on her chest, competing with the excitement of returning to the career she had worked so hard to build. The elevator dinged, breaking her reverie, and Amelia stepped in, joining a few familiar faces who greeted her with polite smiles. The 5th floor, where her office was located, buzzed with Monday morning activity. Her colleagues welcomed her back, but the warm greetings felt a little too brief, a little too rehearsed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Conversations seemed to pause as she passed by, and people averted their eyes ever so subtly. Maybe it's just me, she thought, pushing aside her insecurities. At her desk, everything looked exactly as she had left it. The same stack of files, neatly arranged, the same coffee mug waiting to be filled. But now, tucked into her bag was her breast pump, a constant reminder of her dual role as a professional and a mother. The sight of it made her stomach churn. How was she supposed to fit this into her day? There was no manual for balancing client meetings with the biological demands of motherhood. Before Amelia could dwell on these thoughts, a calendar notification popped up. A team meeting in 20 minutes. She felt a familiar flicker of anxiety. This would be her first chance to reestablish her presence, to show her team that despite the months away, she was still the capable, driven woman they had known. But could she keep up? Would they see her as less committed now that she was a mother? As the meeting began, Amelia found herself trying to follow the rapid-fire updates, the inside jokes that had developed in her absence, and the flow of projects she had once led with ease. When it was her turn to speak, she stumbled for a moment, the words catching in her throat. But then she found her footing, presenting her ideas with the same clarity and confidence that had earned her respect in the first place. The meeting ended, and Amelia felt a wave of cautious optimism wash over her. She had survived her first day back, even scheduled a few client meetings for the following week. Maybe she could do this, be both a dedicated professional and a loving mother. Yet, as Amelia left the meeting, a small knot of anxiety settled in her stomach. It wasn't the workload or even the challenge of balancing motherhood and work. It was the quiet shift in how her colleagues treated her, the subtle exclusion she hadn't noticed before. They no longer looked to her for leadership, no longer sought her out for advice. As she packed up for the day, her smile faltered. Was this the new normal? Amelia's first few days back felt like a blur. Her focus wavered between client calls, project updates, and the gnawing need to express milk without drawing attention. She had carefully timed her schedule, but the constant balancing act was exhausting. Each time she eyed the clock, calculating when she could slip away to pump, she felt a twinge of guilt. Guilt for stepping away from her desk. Guilt for leaving Jack in daycare. But it wasn't until the second week that the optimism she had carefully built began to unravel. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Amelia was racing down the hallway, her chest aching with the familiar pressure that signaled it was time to pump. She had a short window before her next meeting, but a last-minute client call had thrown her off schedule. Spotting an empty conference room, she ducked inside, setting up her breast pump with quick, practiced motions. As the quiet hum filled the room, she closed her eyes, thinking of Jack and his tiny warm hands. Her shoulders relaxed as she allowed herself a moment of peace. Suddenly, the door handle jiggled. Amelia's eyes flew open, her heart pounding. She had locked the door, hadn't she? Before she could react, the door swung open, and there stood Greg, her manager. His face shifted from surprise to discomfort, and then something harder to read. "Oh, Amelia." Greg's voice wavered. His eyes flicked between her and the breast pump in confusion, and then something akin to irritation. "I didn't realize you were in here." Amelia flushed, scrambling to cover herself, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, Greg. I thought I locked the door. I'll be done in a few minutes." Greg shifted on his feet, his expression hardening. "Look, Amelia, I think you should do this at home. It's not really appropriate for the office. Can't you just have the daycare give Jack formula? My kids had it, and they're fine." The words hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but Greg had already turned and backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. Amelia sat there, stunned. Her hands trembled as she packed up her pump, replaying the conversation in her head. Federal law protected her right to express milk at work, and the company had a designated lactation room, though it was often occupied. Using an empty conference room wasn't against any rules, but Greg's words lingered. Not really appropriate for the office. He had dismissed her choice to breastfeed as unprofessional, and that dismissal stung deeply. She shook her head, trying to focus as she returned to her desk, but something had shifted. In Greg's eyes, she was no longer just a senior account manager. She was a mother first, and apparently that made her less capable in his mind. And that was just the beginning. The cracks began to show. The days after Greg's comment passed in a haze of self-doubt and frustration for Amelia. She tried to bury the incident, convincing herself that Greg was just caught off guard, that it was an awkward moment, nothing more. But as the week dragged on, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The atmosphere in the office seemed to shift in ways that were hard to define, but impossible to ignore. On the surface, things appeared normal. Amelia continued to attend meetings, present ideas, and juggle client accounts. But the undercurrent of unease was palpable. Conversations quieted when she entered the room, and colleagues who had once been warm and welcoming now gave her tight-lipped smiles, avoiding eye contact. The collaborative spirit she had once thrived in seemed to have dissolved, leaving her isolated in her own office, adrift in a sea of silent judgment. It wasn't just in the break room or during casual hallway conversations either. Team meetings, which had once been a place where Amelia's ideas were eagerly discussed, now felt different. When it was her turn to speak, her suggestions were met with polite nods and awkward silences. The feedback she had come to expect, whether praise or constructive critique, had vanished. Instead, her contributions were quickly glossed over, as if she hadn't spoken at all. At first, Amelia tried to dismiss it, telling herself she was imagining things, but the signs grew harder to ignore. One afternoon, as she approached the break room, she overheard snippets of conversation. "She's always running off to pump," someone whispered, the words cut off abruptly as she rounded the corner. Another time, she heard her name in passing, followed by a murmured, probably distracted by mom duties. The words stung, cutting deeper than she cared to admit. She was no stranger to the challenges of motherhood, but the idea that her colleagues, People she had once considered friends saw her as less capable, less committed, simply because she was breastfeeding, was a blow she hadn't anticipated. It all came to a head during a critical client presentation. Amelia had been preparing for this moment for weeks. The account was one of the company's largest, and she had meticulously crafted a strategy that she knew would impress. She arrived early, set up her materials, and took a deep breath, ready to deliver. As she stood by the door waiting for the client to arrive, she overheard two colleagues whispering just outside the conference room. "Do you think she's up for this?" One voice said. "Greg should have given this to someone more available," the other replied, his tone dripping with doubt. Amelia froze, her heart racing. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Available. The implication was clear. Because she was a mother, they didn't trust her to handle the responsibility. Her mind raced with indignation, but there was no time to dwell on it. The client was arriving, and she had a job to do. The presentation went flawlessly. The client was impressed, praising her for her innovative ideas and attention to detail. Amelia should have felt triumphant, but the moment felt hollow. No matter how well she performed, the doubt had already taken root. The whispers, the silences, the subtle exclusion. It was clear now that her return to work was far from the seamless transition she had hoped for. As she packed up her materials, her mind raced. She had nailed the presentation, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that her colleagues saw it as a fluke, an anomaly rather than the norm. The Amelia who had once led with confidence was now viewed as a liability, and it cut deeper than she had expected. Over the next few weeks, the isolation grew more intense. Amelia became hyper-aware of every interaction, her senses on high alert for any sign that she was being pushed to the margins. Every sidelong glance, every half-hearted greeting, every conversation that seemed to halt when she approached chipped away at her sense of belonging. The shift in Greg's behavior became particularly noticeable. During meetings, he interrupted her frequently, speaking over her ideas and redirecting the conversation as if she hadn't even spoken. When she submitted reports, he returned them with nitpicky critiques, highlighting minor errors while ignoring the substance of her work. One afternoon, Amelia overheard Greg on a call with a client. "Don't worry," he said smoothly. "I'll handle that account personally. We want to make sure it gets the attention it deserves." A sickening realization washed over Amelia. The client Greg was referring to was hers, an account she had nurtured for years, through ups and downs, long nights, and endless revisions. Now it was being taken away from her without so much as a conversation. Amelia's confidence, once unshakable, began to crumble under the weight of Greg's relentless scrutiny and her colleagues' increasing distance. She found herself questioning every decision, every idea. Where she had once thrived on collaboration and feedback, she now felt like an outsider, clinging to the edges of a team that no longer seemed to value her. In an attempt to prove her worth, Amelia began arriving at the office earlier and staying later, working through lunches and skipping breaks. The balancing act between work and motherhood became a near impossible tightrope walk, as she stretched herself thin trying to be everything to everyone. But no matter how hard she worked, the whispers continued. It all came to a head one Thursday afternoon. Amelia was at her desk, typing up notes for a client meeting when Greg approached her. He leaned casually against her desk, his expression neutral but his tone anything but friendly. "I noticed you're still working on the Berkshire account," he said, his voice deceptively light. "I think it might be best if we reassign that to someone else. You know, someone who can give it their full attention." Amelia's heart sank. The Berkshire account was prestigious, one of the company's biggest clients, and a personal triumph for her. She had brought them in years ago and had managed the account successfully ever since. "I can handle it, Greg," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside her. "I've been managing this account for years. There's no need to reassign it." Greg's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Things change, Amelia. We need to make sure our clients are getting our best work. I'm sure you understand." Amelia stared at him, Feeling the ground shift beneath her, the implication was clear. In Greg's eyes, she was no longer capable of delivering her best work. The role of a mother had, in his view, diminished her capabilities as a professional. As Greg walked away, Amelia sat at her desk, staring blankly at the screen. The air around her felt thick, oppressive. She could feel the weight of her colleagues' silent judgments pressing down on her, suffocating her confidence and her sense of self. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Amelia tried to focus on her work, but the whispers in the back of her mind were louder than ever. Each time she looked up from her desk, she saw the small groups of coworkers huddled together, their conversations halting abruptly as soon as they noticed her. The unspoken exclusion was more painful than any outright confrontation could have been. By the time she left the office that evening, Amelia felt like a stranger in her own workplace. The camaraderie and collaboration that had once defined her career were gone, replaced by an icy silence that left her questioning everything she had worked so hard to build. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Jack's daycare, a reminder of his upcoming checkup. The sight of his name on the screen brought a lump to her throat. She was fighting to be both a dedicated mother and a successful professional, but right now, it felt like she was failing at both. Sitting in her car, Amelia closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the exhaustion of the day weighing heavily on her. She had always prided herself on her resilience, but now, for the first time in her career, she felt like she was losing control. The whispers, the exclusion, the constant pressure to prove herself, it was all becoming too much. But as she sat there, Amelia made a decision. She wasn't going to let Greg or anyone else push her out. She had fought too hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't about to back down now. She would find a way to reclaim her place, both as a mother and as a professional. Little did she know, the battles ahead would test her in ways she had never imagined. What seemed like subtle exclusions were about to evolve into a full-blown war of attrition, and the real test of her resilience was yet to come. The quiet rebellion begins. Amelia's resolve to reclaim her position only strengthened over the next few weeks, but the road ahead was more treacherous than she anticipated. What started as whispered conversations and veiled judgments soon escalated into blatant acts of exclusion. It became increasingly clear that Greg had shifted from being the supportive manager to a quiet but relentless adversary. Yet the hostility wasn't direct. It was the subtle kind of discrimination that eroded one's confidence in a way that felt impossible to prove. She arrived at work earlier than ever, determined to get a jump on the day before anyone else arrived. The quiet of the office in the early morning was comforting, a reminder of the calm before the storm. She relished those first few hours, the only time when she wasn't constantly on edge, waiting for the next subtle blow to her reputation. But the real challenge wasn't the workload. Amelia could handle deadlines and client demands. She thrived under pressure. What weighed on her was the increasing difficulty of balancing her responsibilities as a mother and as an employee in a work culture that subtly undermined her every move. One morning, she received an email from HR reminding her of the company's policy regarding breastfeeding breaks. The tone of the message was polite, almost innocuous, but Amelia knew exactly what it meant. Someone, probably Greg, had raised concerns about her taking time to pump. The email mentioned that while the company fully supported working mothers, they expected all employees to be mindful of their work hours and not abuse the flexibility provided. It was a slap in the face. Amelia knew she wasn't abusing anything. She had meticulously planned her schedule, squeezing in pumping breaks between meetings and client calls, often sacrificing her own lunch to stay on top of her workload. But this email felt like a warning, a prelude to something more insidious. She could already hear Greg's voice in her head. "Amelia, we're concerned about your productivity." She shut her laptop and sat back in her chair, feeling the walls close in around her. How had things spiraled so quickly? A year ago, she had been one of the company's top performers, trusted to lead major accounts and mentor junior staff. Now her every move was being scrutinized through the lens of her motherhood. And the worst part was, it wasn't something she could fight head-on. There were no overt accusations, no direct confrontation, just a slow, steady erosion of her professional standing. That afternoon, as Amelia was packing up to leave, Greg appeared at her desk, his usual smirk replaced by a more formal, almost rehearsed expression. "Hey, Amelia," he began, his tone measured. "I need to talk to you for a minute." Her heart sank. She knew what was coming, but she nodded anyway, bracing herself for the inevitable conversation. Greg motioned for her to follow him into his office, and she complied, steeling herself for what felt like the 100th confrontation in recent weeks. Once inside, Greg closed the door and leaned against his desk, arms crossed. His demeanor was casual, but Amelia could see the tension in his posture. "Look, I've been reviewing some of your recent work," he began, his voice betraying none of the warmth he once had. "And I'm concerned about a few things. You've been missing some key meetings, and your reports aren't as thorough as they used to be. I understand that coming back from maternity leave is an adjustment, but we need to make sure you're fully engaged with your responsibilities." Amelia felt her pulse quicken. She had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud still made her blood boil. "I haven't missed any meetings, Greg," she replied, her voice carefully measured. "And as for my reports, they'd been just as thorough as they've always been. If you have specific feedback, I'm happy to address it. But I think it's important to acknowledge that I've been working just as hard, if not harder, since I came back." Greg didn't respond immediately. He watched her, his expression unreadable, before giving a small dismissive shrug. "Amelia, no one's questioning your commitment," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "But things have changed since you left. The team dynamic has shifted, and we need everyone to be fully invested." It was a familiar refrain, one that Amelia had heard countless times in subtle variations. "Things have changed. We need you to be fully invested." She knew what he was really saying. "You're not the same as you were before you became a mother. You're not what we need anymore." "Fully invested," Amelia echoed, her voice hardening despite her efforts to remain calm. "Greg, I am fully invested. I'm here early every day. I stay late when needed. I take my breaks when I'm legally entitled to. And I make sure my work is completed on time. If there's an issue with my performance, I'd like to know exactly what it is, because vague concerns about team dynamics aren't helpful." Greg sighed, clearly frustrated that she wasn't backing down as easily as he'd hoped. "I'm just trying to make sure we're on the same page," he said, his tone shifting to something more conciliatory. "I know balancing work and family can be difficult. I want to make sure you have the support you need." Amelia clenched her fists under the desk, fighting the urge to lash out. This was the tactic they used when they wanted to seem supportive, while simultaneously undermining her. "Thank you," she said, her voice cold. "I have all the support I need, but I'd appreciate it if you could be more specific with your feedback." Greg stared at her for a moment, clearly caught off guard by her refusal to be cornered. Finally, he nodded, though his expression suggested that this conversation was far from over. "All right, Amelia," he said, standing up and motioning toward the door. "We'll keep an eye on things. Let's make sure we're both aligned going forward." Amelia nodded stiffly, exiting his office without another word. As she made her way back to her desk, her mind was racing. This wasn't just about her performance. Greg was building a case, a narrative where Amelia was the problem, where her need to pump or balance her work and motherhood was a burden on the company. And if she wasn't careful, he'd find a way to push her out, under the guise of concern for the team. That evening, Amelia sat in her car in the parking lot, staring blankly at the dashboard. The cold glow of the streetlights outside cast long, eerie shadows across the empty lot, and she felt a sense of profound loneliness settle over her. She had always been a fighter, but this was different. The battle she was fighting wasn't one that could be won with hard work or perseverance. It was a slow, insidious war of perception, one where the enemy wasn't a single person or event, but an entire culture that saw motherhood as a weakness. The next day, Amelia decided it was time to seek help, not from Greg, not from HR, both of which had made it clear that they weren't on her side. No, this was bigger than a workplace conflict. This was discrimination. And if her company wouldn't acknowledge it, she needed to find someone who would. She took out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she had been holding onto for weeks. Sarah Martinez, a labor attorney who specialized in workplace discrimination cases, had come highly recommended by a friend. Amelia had been hesitant to reach out before, worried that involving a lawyer would escalate the situation beyond repair. But now, with Greg clearly laying the groundwork to force her out, she knew she didn't have a choice. The call was short, professional, but filled with understanding. Sarah listened as Amelia explained the situation, her voice faltering slightly as she recounted Greg's subtle exclusion, the whispered remarks, and the email from HR. "This is more common than you think," Sarah said, her voice calm and reassuring. "It's called the motherhood penalty, and it happens all the time. Employers often see working mothers as less committed, less capable, and they start to find ways to push them out. What you're describing sounds like a textbook case." Amelia felt a surge of relief, followed quickly by anger. The term, motherhood penalty, hit her hard. She had heard it before, but never thought it would apply to her. She had worked so hard to prove that being a mother didn't diminish her capabilities, and yet here she was, fighting to keep her job simply because she had chosen to breastfeed her son. "What can I do?" Amelia asked, her voice steadier now. "We'll start by documenting everything," Sarah replied. "Every email, every conversation, every instance where you feel you've been treated differently since returning from maternity leave. We need to build a case that shows a clear pattern of discrimination." Amelia nodded, determination settling in her bones. This was going to be a long, difficult fight, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had an advocate in Sarah, and more importantly, she had the truth on her side. Over the next few days, Amelia began meticulously documenting every interaction, every meeting where she was sidelined, every conversation where Greg subtly undermined her authority. She kept a log of her work hours, her pumping breaks, her client calls, and her performance reviews, all in an effort to build a case that proved she wasn't the problem. Her workplace's bias was. But as she dug deeper into her own experience, she began to notice something even more troubling. She wasn't the only one. Other women in the office, particularly those who had children, seemed to be. The gathering storm. Amelia's realization hit her like a lightning bolt. She wasn't alone. In the quiet corridors of Pinnacle Marketing, where polished professionalism masked deeper truths, she began to see the signs. It started subtly. The long silences when certain women were mentioned in meetings, the way projects were quietly reassigned after a colleague returned from maternity leave, and the subtle shifting of responsibilities that left mothers doing less visible, less glamorous work. It was happening all around her, a quiet erosion of the careers of women who dared to have families. One afternoon, as she was tidying up her desk, Amelia received an unexpected email. It was from Lisa, a colleague in the marketing department who had just returned from her own maternity leave a few months prior. The subject line read, "Can we talk?" Intrigued, Amelia quickly typed a response, agreeing to meet Lisa for coffee at a nearby cafe after work. That evening, as the warm glow of the setting sun filled the cafe, Lisa walked in, looking nervous and a bit tired. Amelia immediately noticed the dark circles under her eyes, an all-too-familiar sign of sleepless nights and the unrelenting demands of motherhood. Lisa's warm smile was genuine, though tinged with a nervous energy. They sat down, and after the usual small talk about their children, Lisa cut to the chase. "I heard about what's been happening with you," Lisa began, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "The pumping, the comments, the way Greg has been treating you. I've seen it before. I've been dealing with the same thing ever since I came back from leave. I didn't realize how bad it was until I started noticing the way they phase you out. Amelia's chest tightened. She had suspected this, but hearing someone else confirm her own experience made it feel all the more real. Phasing out was the perfect way to describe it. A gradual, almost imperceptible process where a once valuable employee became invisible, her contributions minimized until she was no longer seen as integral to the company. Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. When I came back after maternity leave, it was like I wasn't really part of the team anymore. They reassigned some of my clients, which I thought was temporary, but months later, I'm still not getting any of my major accounts back. And whenever I ask about it, they just say something vague like, "We're still rebalancing the workload." It's like I'm being punished for having a baby. Amelia nodded, a deep sense of empathy settling over her. That's exactly how I feel. Gray has been nitpicking everything I do. And the other day, he tried to reassign one of my biggest accounts. I've been documenting everything and working with a lawyer, but I didn't realize how systemic this was. I thought it was just me. Lisa's eyes widened. A lawyer? You're serious about this? I have to be, Amelia said, her voice firm. If I don't fight back now, they'll push me out, just like they've done to others. And it's not just about me. It's about all of us. We have to make them see that we're not going to let them treat us like we're disposable just because we have families. Lisa leaned back in her chair, her expression a mixture of relief and fear. I've been wanting to speak up for months, but I was scared. I didn't want to rock the boat or jeopardize my job. But you're right. It's not just us. I've talked to Emma from HR, and she's been feeling the same way since she had her baby. She's afraid to do anything about it, though. She said HR is more interested in protecting the company than protecting employees. Amelia wasn't surprised. HR had always given her the sense that they were there to maintain the status quo rather than advocate for the staff. Still, hearing it out loud stung. If even HR was complicit, it meant the battle would be that much harder. The conversation with Lisa solidified something in Amelia. A deep, simmering anger that was no longer content to be suppressed. What she was dealing with wasn't just an isolated case of workplace discrimination. It was a culture that systematically devalued women the moment they became mothers. And if that culture wasn't challenged, nothing would ever change. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of secret meetings, hushed conversations, and quiet alliances. Word spread quickly throughout the office that Amelia was gathering evidence and working with a lawyer. Women from different departments, some she barely knew, began to approach her with their own stories of quiet sidelining, missed promotions, and reduced responsibilities after becoming mothers. Each story was a painful echo of her own experience, and each one added fuel to her determination. One morning, Amelia arrived at her desk to find a neatly folded note slipped under her keyboard. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. They're watching you. Be careful. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She looked around the office, scanning the faces of her coworkers, trying to figure out who might have left the note. Were they watching her? It seemed paranoid, but she knew better than to dismiss the possibility. Greg had been acting strange lately, more distant than usual, and she had noticed a few unusual glances from Janice, the HR director, during meetings. A chill ran down her spine, but she quickly shoved the note into her drawer. She wasn't going to let fear stop her now. She had come too far to turn back. That same day, Greg called her into his office for yet another performance review. The tone was familiar by now, polite, but dripping with passive-aggressive condescension. Amelia, I've noticed you've been having more side conversations with other team members lately, Greg said, leaning back in his chair, his hands folded on his lap. I just want to remind you that we need to maintain a professional atmosphere, and any concerns you have should go through the proper channels, HR, or me. Amelia kept her face neutral, though her blood was boiling. This was a warning. He knew she was talking to people, building her case. He wanted to scare her into silence. I understand, Greg. she replied calmly. "I've always maintained professionalism in the office. I'm simply discussing ideas and collaborating with my colleagues. Is there something specific that's bothering you?" Greg hesitated for a moment, clearly trying to gauge whether she would back down. When she didn't, he shifted gears. "It's just that we've had some feedback from others that your focus seems to be elsewhere lately. I know it can be tough juggling motherhood and work, but we need to make sure everyone is fully committed to their roles here. The team relies on you." Amelia stared at him, her mind racing. He was trying to box her into the same narrative again. That motherhood had somehow diminished her capabilities, that she wasn't as focused or dedicated as she had been before. But this time, she was ready. "Greg, I assure you, my focus is right where it needs to be," Amelia said, her voice steady but firm. "And if you or anyone else has concerns about my performance, I'd appreciate specific feedback, not vague comments about my focus. I've been performing my duties at the same level I always have." Greg's expression flickered with irritation, but he quickly masked it with his usual managerial smile. "Of course, Amelia. Just making sure we're all on the same page." Amelia left his office, her mind buzzing with the realization that things were escalating. Greg wasn't going to let this go, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. The note had been right. He was watching her. But she wasn't about to be intimidated. Not now. As the weeks wore on, the cracks in Pinnacle Marketing's facade of professionalism began to show. Amelia's quiet rebellion had sparked something in the office. More women came forward, emboldened by her stand, sharing their stories with her in whispered conversations in the break room or in secret meetings after work. They formed a loose alliance, a group of women who had experienced the same quiet exclusion, the same dismissal of their abilities after becoming mothers. Emma from HR had been one of the first to approach Amelia in private. "I'm scared," Emma had admitted one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen this happen before, but I didn't know what to do. HR is supposed to help, but they're part of the problem." Amelia's heart went out to Emma. She could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear she had felt when she first realized what was happening. But that fear had turned into something else now. Resolve. "We can't let them win," Amelia had replied. "We have rights, and we have each other. If we don't fight back, they'll keep doing this to every woman who has a family." Emma nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in her gaze. "I don't know what the end game is here, but I'm with you." As the momentum built, Greg seemed to grow more paranoid. His subtle bards became more frequent, his comments about Amelia's focus more pointed. It wasn't just Greg, either. The company itself seemed to be watching her more closely. She noticed small changes. Her projects were reassigned without warning, and her calendar filled with more unnecessary meetings. It felt like they were trying to overwhelm her, to make her feel like she was slipping up. But Amelia stayed vigilant, documenting everything, keeping her lawyer, Sarah, updated on every move. One evening, after everyone had left the office, Amelia sat alone at her desk, going through her notes. Her mind was swirling with the weight of everything: her fight for respect at work, the constant balancing act of being a mother, and the toll it was taking on her emotionally. She glanced at a photo of Jack on her desk, his bright smile lighting up her weary heart. This wasn't just about her. It was about creating a world where her son, and every child, could grow up knowing that their mothers, parents, could have fulfilling careers without being punished for it. Just then, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Sarah. The message was short, but its implications were vast. "We're ready to make a move. Let's talk tomorrow." Amelia sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The battle was coming to a head. It was time to take the next step. The quiet rebellion was over. It was time for a revolution. The battle for justice. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Amelia woke up the next morning. The weight of the previous evening's message from Sarah was still fresh in her mind, settling over her like a heavy blanket. Today wasn't just another day at the office. It marked the beginning of something much bigger. The quiet rebellion she had led with her colleagues had set the stage. But now, it was time for formal action. As she dressed for work, Amelia felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The fear that had once gripped her had been replaced by a fierce resolve. She had spent months gathering evidence, documenting every slight, every snide remark, every unjustified critique from Greg. Now, with Sarah's help, she was ready to confront the systemic discrimination at Pinnacle Marketing head-on. Her mind buzzed as she drove to the office. Sarah had been clear in their late-night conversation. Today was about making a formal complaint to HR, backed by the mountain of evidence Amelia had compiled. But it wasn't just about filing a complaint. It was about shaking the very foundations of the company's culture. Amelia knew that once the complaint was lodged, there would be no turning back. This was the kind of fight that could end careers, burn bridges, and make enemies of former allies. But Amelia had always known the risks. What she hadn't anticipated was just how many women would stand behind her. Over the past few weeks, her informal coalition had grown stronger. Emma from HR, despite her initial fear, had been providing Amelia with critical insights about the company's inner workings. Lisa, Sarah, and others from across different departments had shared their own experiences, and more than a few had offered to testify if it came to that. They were building something powerful, something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed as the complaints of a few disgruntled employees, and that scared the people in charge. As Amelia pulled into the parking lot, she noticed a few familiar faces in their cars, women who had confided in her over the past few months. They nodded at her as she walked past, their expressions a mix of encouragement and anxiety. Word had spread quickly about what was coming today, and everyone knew it could change the company forever. Amelia took a deep breath as she entered the building. The familiar scent of coffee and printer ink filled the air. But today, the office felt different. There was a palpable tension, a kind of electric energy that made her heart race as she headed to her desk. She had scheduled a meeting with Janice, the HR director, for later that morning. It was time. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. Amelia kept her head down, focusing on preparing for the meeting. She wasn't naive. She knew Janice wouldn't be on her side. HR's role was to protect the company, not its employees, and if Janice had already been turning a blind eye to the issues with Greg, it meant she was likely complicit in some way. But Amelia wasn't going into this meeting expecting support from HR. She was going in to make it official, to create a record that couldn't be ignored. At 10 a.m., her phone buzzed with a reminder. It was time. Amelia stood up, smoothing down the front of her blazer, and walked toward Janice's office with steady, measured steps. She knocked lightly, and a moment later, Janice's voice called from inside. "Come in." Janice's office was the epitome of corporate neatness. Everything in its place, every file neatly stacked. Behind the large desk, Janice looked up from her computer with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Greg sat beside her, a surprise that Amelia had half expected but still felt like a blow. His presence turned this from a discussion into an ambush. She kept her expression neutral as she entered, holding her head high. "Amelia, have a seat," Janice said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Amelia took a seat, her spine straight, her hands resting in her lap. She refused to show any sign of the nerves that buzzed beneath the surface. "Thanks for making time to meet," Amelia began, her voice calm but firm. "There are some issues I've been dealing with since returning from maternity leave, and I believe they need to be addressed formally." Janice exchanged a quick glance with Greg, and Amelia could see the calculation in their eyes. They had expected this, but they weren't prepared for what came next. "I've experienced a pattern of behavior from Greg that amounts to workplace discrimination," Amelia continued, pulling out the neatly organized file she had prepared. "It began shortly after my return from maternity leave, when I noticed a shift in how my responsibilities were managed. My accounts were reassigned, and my contributions in meetings were minimized." She laid out her evidence calmly, methodically, as though she were presenting a client pitch. Emails, performance reviews, and notes on conversations, all documented with dates, details, and proof of the subtle yet unmistakable bias she had experienced. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but remained silent. Janice, on the other hand, maintained her neutral expression, though the tension in her posture betrayed her discomfort. She had expected complaints, perhaps, but not this level of thoroughness. "Amelia," Janice finally said, her voice carefully measured, "I understand you've had some challenges adjusting since your return, but I want to assure you that we take all concerns seriously. That said, we've also received feedback about your performance, and it's important that we maintain a balanced perspective." The patronizing tone in Janice's voice set Amelia's teeth on edge, but she remained composed. She knew what Janice was doing, framing this as a performance issue rather than an issue of discrimination. But Amelia was ready. "I've also documented my performance," Amelia said, her voice steady as she slid another document across the table. "Here's a list of all the accounts I've managed since returning, including client feedback, project timelines, and completion rates. As you can see, my performance hasn't declined, and there are no documented concerns before my return from maternity leave. The issue isn't my performance. It's how I've been treated since I became a mother." Janice's expression flickered, but she quickly regained her composure. Greg remained silent, his face unreadable. Amelia could feel the tension rising, the air in the room thick with unspoken accusations. "I understand your concerns," Janice said, her voice taking on a softer, more conciliatory tone. "But we do have to consider the feedback we've received from your manager, Greg, and others on the team. If there have been misunderstandings, I'm sure we can resolve them through open communication. Perhaps we can set up a performance improvement plan to ensure that everyone is on the same page moving forward." A performance improvement plan. Amelia's heart sank. This was exactly what she had feared. They were framing her complaint as a performance issue so they could build a case to push her out. But she had come prepared. "I'm not interested in a performance improvement plan," Amelia said firmly. "What I want is for the company to address the discrimination I've experienced and to ensure that no other working mother has to go through what I've been through." Janice's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but her smile never faltered. "Of course, we'll take your concerns seriously, Amelia. But I think it's important to approach this from a place of collaboration rather than confrontation." Collaboration. Amelia nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. They were trying to paint her as unreasonable, as someone causing problems rather than addressing legitimate concerns. But she wasn't about to back down. "I've already consulted with my lawyer," Amelia said, her voice calm but filled with an unshakable resolve. "We're prepared to file a formal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, if necessary. But I would prefer to resolve this internally, through meaningful action from the company." The room went still. Greg's face paled ever so slightly, and Janice's smile tightened. They hadn't expected this. They had expected Amelia to be intimidated, to back down at the first sign of resistance. But she had just thrown the weight of the law behind her complaint, and now they were scrambling to keep control of the situation. "Amelia, let's not rush to legal action," Janice said, her tone suddenly more conciliatory. "We want to support you, and I'm sure we can come to a resolution that works for everyone." "I want more than a resolution," Amelia said, leaning forward, her eyes locked on Janice's. "I want change. I want policies in place that protect working mothers, and I want accountability for the way I've been treated." The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Amelia could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't waver. She had come too far to let them dismiss her now. Finally, Janice nodded, though her expression remained tight. "We'll look into your concerns, Amelia. I'll schedule a follow-up meeting once we've reviewed everything." Amelia stood up, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. "Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you." With that, She walked out of the office, feeling the eyes of her colleagues on her as she made her way back to her desk. She had just thrown a stone into a still pond, and now she was waiting for the ripples to spread. The following days were a blur of tension and whispered conversations. Word of Amelia's confrontation with HR had spread like wildfire, and the atmosphere in the office became even more charged. Some colleagues avoided her entirely, clearly afraid of being associated with someone who was challenging the company so publicly. Others, particularly the women who had shared their own stories of discrimination, approached her quietly, offering words of support and solidarity. Emma from HR was one of the first to reach out after the meeting. "They're scared," Emma said during a hushed conversation in the break room. "You've shaken them, and they don't know how to handle it." Amelia nodded, feeling the weight of what she had done settling over her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the women who had been sidelined, dismissed, or discriminated against because of their roles as mothers. And it wasn't just about this company. It was about a culture that devalued working mothers, that saw them as less capable, less committed, simply because they had children. As the days passed, Amelia received updates from Sarah, her lawyer, who had already begun preparing the formal complaint for the EEOC. They knew the company would try to delay, to minimize, to make it seem like the issue was about one disgruntled employee rather than a systemic problem. But Amelia was ready. She wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who had ever been told that motherhood was a weakness, for every working parent who had been made to feel less than because they were raising children while pursuing their career. The battle was far from over, but Amelia was ready for whatever came next. The turning point. The days following Amelia's meeting with HR passed in a blur of tension and anticipation. She knew she had lit a fuse, but she couldn't yet see how fast the fire would burn. The usual rhythms of office life continued, but the undercurrent of uncertainty rippled through the corridors. The gossip, which had once been limited to hushed conversations in the break room, had now spilled into every corner of Pinnacle marketing. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know when. Amelia spent those days preparing for the inevitable storm. Sarah, her lawyer, was a constant presence, guiding her through each step of the legal process. Together, they had meticulously crafted the formal complaint for the EEOC, detailing the pattern of discrimination Amelia had endured since returning from maternity leave. Every meeting with Greg, every critical email, every slight shift in her responsibilities, it was all laid bare in the complaint, a damning testament to the company's disregard for its working mothers. But Amelia's battle was about more than her personal experience. As her informal coalition of women continued to grow, she realized the scope of the problem was far larger than she had imagined. The stories that emerged from her colleagues were heartbreaking, infuriating, and disturbingly similar. Women who had once been leaders in their departments, trusted with the company's most valuable accounts, had been quietly phased out after becoming mothers. Promotions had been withheld, opportunities reassigned, all in the name of team dynamics and productivity. The message was clear. Motherhood was a liability. Amelia knew that the real fight wasn't just about winning her own case. It was about changing the company, and perhaps even the industry. If she succeeded, she could set a precedent that would protect other women from the quiet, insidious discrimination that had plagued her workplace. But there was no denying the toll it was taking on her. Late at night, after Jack was asleep, Amelia would sit at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents, her mind buzzing with exhaustion. Her body ached from the tension of constant vigilance, and her heart felt heavy with the weight of what was at stake. She had always been resilient, but now, more than ever, she felt the strain of trying to balance the roles of mother, professional, and advocate. And yet, every time she looked at the photo of Jack on her desk, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring a better future for her son, and for every child whose mother had been forced to choose between her family and her career. 2 weeks after Amelia's meeting with HR, the response finally came. Janice called Amelia into her office for a follow-up meeting. But this time, Something felt different. Janice's usual calm, polished demeanor seemed to falter ever so slightly, her eyes darting nervously as Amelia entered the room. Greg was there, as expected, but this time they were joined by a man Amelia hadn't seen before, a lawyer, no doubt brought in to protect the company's interests. "Amelia, thank you for coming," Janice began, her voice tighter than usual. "We've reviewed your concerns and discussed them internally. We take all complaints seriously, and we want to ensure that Pinnacle Marketing is a fair and supportive workplace for everyone." Amelia sat quietly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She could already sense where this was going. However, Janice continued, exchanging a glance with the lawyer. "We've also reviewed feedback from your manager and other members of your team, and we believe that there may have been some misunderstandings regarding your performance. We'd like to offer a compromise." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "A compromise?" "Yes," the lawyer chimed in, his tone smooth and practiced. "We'd like to offer a voluntary severance package, which would allow you to transition out of the company on your own terms. In exchange, we'd ask that you withdraw your complaint and sign a confidentiality agreement. It's a generous offer, and we believe it's the best solution for all parties involved." There it was, the company's attempt to buy her silence. Amelia had been expecting this, but hearing the words still sent a wave of anger coursing through her. They thought they could sweep this under the rug, that they could pay her to disappear and pretend nothing had ever happened. It was a strategy as old as corporate America itself. Silence the whistleblower before the problem becomes public. But Amelia wasn't about to be silenced. She had come too far to back down now. "Thank you for the offer," Amelia said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "But I'm not interested in severance. I'm interested in accountability. I want real change, not a payout to make this go away." Janice shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. "Amelia, we want to work with you, but you have to understand that these things are complicated. We're offering a fair solution." "A fair solution," Amelia repeated, her anger rising. "A fair solution would be acknowledging the discrimination I've faced and the discrimination other women here have faced. A fair solution would be implementing policies that actually support working mothers instead of punishing them for having families." The lawyer leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Amelia, I'd advise you to reconsider. Legal action could be detrimental to both you and the company. This severance package is more than fair, and it allows you to leave with dignity." Amelia stared at him, incredulous. "Dignity? You think it's dignified to accept hush money so you can continue to discriminate against women like me? No, I'm not backing down. I've already filed my complaint with the EEOC, and I intend to see this through." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Janice's carefully composed facade cracked, just for a second, as she realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't going to go away with a severance check and a non-disclosure agreement. Amelia wasn't the kind of woman they could quietly push out. The lawyer's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, clearly reassessing the situation. Greg, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had likely expected this to be over by now, that Amelia would take the money and walk away quietly. But as she looked at him, she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He knew this was slipping out of his control. Amelia stood, gathering her things. "If you're serious about resolving this, you know where to find me. But I won't be silenced, and I won't let this company get away with what it's done to me and other women." With that, she left the office, her heart pounding with adrenaline. She had just declared war on her company, and there was no turning back now. Over the next few weeks, the battle intensified. The company's attempts to discredit Amelia grew more blatant. Rumors circulated about her lack of focus and performance issues. Colleagues who had once been supportive suddenly grew distant, clearly afraid of being associated with someone who was now seen as a troublemaker. The isolation was suffocating, but Amelia pressed on, knowing that this was exactly what they wanted, to break her resolve. to make her doubt herself. But she didn't doubt herself. Not anymore. She had her coalition, her lawyer, and the strength of knowing that she was fighting for something bigger than herself. And she wasn't alone. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "We've got the media's attention." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. The media. This was the turning point she had been waiting for. A few days later, Amelia found herself sitting in a brightly lit newsroom, a microphone clipped to her blazer. Across from her sat a journalist from a major news outlet, a woman known for her hard-hitting investigative reports on corporate corruption and workplace discrimination. Amelia had agreed to do the interview after weeks of careful deliberation, knowing full well the risks. Once the story went public, there would be no going back. Her career at Pinnacle Marketing would likely be over, but at this point, she didn't care. This was about something bigger. The camera lights flickered on, and the interview began. "Amelia," the journalist started, her tone professional but empathetic. "You've brought forward some serious allegations about workplace discrimination at Pinnacle Marketing. Can you tell us what led you to this point?" Amelia took a deep breath, glancing briefly at the camera before turning back to the journalist. "It started when I returned from maternity leave. I came back expecting to pick up where I left off. But I quickly realized that things had changed. My accounts were reassigned, my contributions in meetings were minimized, and I began to notice a pattern of exclusion and subtle discrimination. It wasn't just me. Other women, particularly mothers, were experiencing the same thing." The journalist nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And what happened when you brought these concerns to HR?" Amelia's jaw tightened as she recounted her experience. "I tried to address the issue internally, but HR wasn't interested in protecting me. They were more concerned with protecting the company. When I refused to accept a severance package to stay silent, they started discrediting me. It became clear that the company didn't want to fix the problem. They wanted to bury it." The interview continued, with Amelia laying out the full scope of her experience. The discrimination, the exclusion, the company's attempts to silence her. But it wasn't just her story she told. She spoke of the other women who had been affected, the culture of subtle but pervasive discrimination that punished women for being mothers. When the interview ended, Amelia felt an overwhelming sense of relief. She had told her story, and now it was out of her hands. The public would decide what happened next. The fallout from the interview was swift and brutal. The day after it aired, Pinnacle Marketing CEO issued a public statement, denying the allegations and claiming that the company was committed to diversity and inclusion. But behind the scenes, things were different. The company's board of directors, fearing the negative publicity, launched an internal investigation. Greg was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. But the real impact was felt outside the walls of Pinnacle Marketing. Amelia's story had struck a nerve with working mothers across the country. Social media exploded with stories from other women who had faced similar discrimination in their workplaces. The hashtag #MothersAtWork started trending as women shared their experiences of being sidelined, underpaid, and devalued after having children. Amelia became a symbol of the fight for workplace equality, her face appearing on news channels and online articles. She received messages from women across industries, thanking her for standing up and giving them the courage to do the same. But for all the public support, the battle was far from over. The company fought back, dragging out the legal process in an attempt to wear her down. They offered larger and larger settlements, each time with the stipulation that she would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. But Amelia refused. This wasn't about money. It was about making sure no other woman had to go through what she had. Months later, the EEOC concluded its investigation, ruling in Amelia's favor. The company was found to have violated federal anti-discrimination laws, and they were ordered to implement new policies to protect working mothers, including flexible schedules, on-site lactation rooms, and stronger protections against retaliation. Greg was quietly fired, and Janice was reassigned to a lower role within the company. For Amelia, The victory was bittersweet. She had won, but the cost had been high. Her career at Pinnacle Marketing was over, and the emotional toll of the battle had left her drained. But as she sat in her lawyer's office, signing the final documents, she knew it had been worth it. The fight wasn't just about her. It was about every woman who had ever been made to feel less than because she was a mother. As she left the office and walked into the bright afternoon sun, Amelia felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced down a system that had tried to silence her, and she had won. And now she could finally focus on the future, on Jack, on her career, and on the new opportunities that lay ahead. The world had changed, even if just a little, and she had been part of that change. And so, Amelia's journey came to a close, not with a neat, tidy ending, but with the knowledge that her fight had made a difference. Her story was just one of many, but it was a reminder that sometimes the quietest voices could spark the biggest revolutions.